There is no war without propaganda. It produces images of the enemy, stirs up fear, feelings of revenge, and guilt. It fights with exaggerations, with slogans and lies. Its weapons are the mass media. The power of moving pictures, initially tested in the First World War. Radio and film with sound gave propaganda completely new possibilities.
Amerikanische Sherman-Panzer brechen in ein von Infanteristen und Fallschirmjägern gehaltenes Dorf ein. Ein deutscher Kriegsberichter filmt den Panzereinbruch aus unmittelbarer Nähe.
Television brings war into living rooms.
Good morning, greeting to the Viet Cong for the B-52.
In the age of the internet, it is not the lack of, but the abundance of information that makes it easy for propagandists and difficult for the truth. Operation Desert Storm in 1991 marked the beginning of a new era in war reporting. While the Vietnam War took place without censorship, the U.S. then changed its policy.
The
strict media policy in the run-up to and during the Second Gulf War in 1990-91 and the Iraq War in 2003 can only be understood through an examination of Vietnam and the myth that the media ended the war in Vietnam.
The images of the bombardment of Baghdad look like a computer game. Television viewers around the world could experience the start of the war from a distance. Television had become the most influential mass medium.
Sie haben Bilder.
You have images coming live into living rooms from the war. The first example of real-time coverage was Peter Arnett's in 1991, when he captured the first missile fired at Baghdad. He was the big star. He introduced real-time reporting.
The war got the so-called CNN factor. Journalists became vicarious agents of the military, but also influenced their decisions.
Lobbied the Iraqis every day to give me information. I mean, every morning I got up, I told myself, I've got to get a story today. And I'd get the Iraqis and I'd grab them and I'd persuade them, I'd threaten them, I'd do anything to get the story.
The horror of the war only appeared in pictures afterwards. U.S. propaganda, on the other hand, only showed the soldiers' compassionate side as helpers in reconstruction.
Once the war in Kuwait was over, American soldiers pitched in to help the Kuwaitis. Psychological operations assisted by providing information in the form of radio, video, printed products, and face-to-face communications with the civilians trying to rebuild their lives.
12 years later, the manipulation of the public reached a new dimension. The U.S. justified the start of the Third Gulf War with a brazen lie.
I take the fact that he develops weapons of mass destruction very seriously.
From the beginning, the media had been involved in the U.S. military's war strategies, conveying what the public should and was allowed to know.
We cannot get power directly, but we must first conquer the public space before we conquer the language. We have to conquer the journalists, we have to conquer the think tanks, the public space of consciousness, so to speak, and then, only when we have the certainty that we have conquered the language, only then do we have a possibility of becoming politically successful.
The Iraqi army was quickly defeated, but the U.S. underestimated the simmering conflicts in the country. Celebrated liberators became hated occupiers. Even the arrest of Saddam Hussein did not change anything. The war continued.
Americans can dominate our bodies, but they will never conquer our souls, our will, and our faith.
Religious struggles turned into acts of terror. The Iraq War became the nucleus of the Islamic State. The U.S. soldiers left. How the war had been staged for the public was, nevertheless, a success.
In the Iraq War of 2003, the strategies of politicians and military leaders worked out perfectly. The war itself worked out perfectly in terms of staging.
A Republican Guard parade in Baghdad in 1990, a military show for the despot Saddam Hussein. Oil made him a coveted business partner for the West, a man who allowed himself to be praised as an irreplaceable leader, but at the end of his reign, crawled into a hole in the ground. When a Shiite cleric overthrew the Shah in neighboring Iran, Saddam saw an opportunity to expand his sphere of power. He invaded the country, but the hoped-for quick victory turned into a bloody war of attrition. In the West, a defeat for Saddam seemed unimaginable at the time, recalled war correspondent Ulrich Tilgner.
The Frankfurter Rundschau didn't run a piece I wrote on the Iran-Iraq war because I said that Iran would not lose this war. And then it did. Then the editors in Frankfurt said that's nonsense because Saddam Hussein had invited, 200 Western journalists to broadcast his version of the war to the world. That's the only article that was really removed because they said in Frankfurt that it couldn't be.
As a special envoy of the U.S. government, Donald Rumsfeld assured Baghdad of U.S. financial and military support. The first Gulf War ended with a ceasefire, but Saddam celebrated it as a victory. In the U.S., distrust of the former protégé grew. When Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990, the friendship finally ended. A PR event was staged which was intended to bring decision-makers and the public in the U.S. to accept a move toward war.
Propaganda arbeitet wie Werbung mit sehr starken emotionalen Schlüsselreizen.
Propaganda works like advertising with very strong emotional key stimuli. One of the best key stimuli was the child scheme, and it can't be beaten for effectiveness. There was this story in 1990. A 15-year-old alleged Kuwaiti nurse, Dalia, told this story in numerous appearances in tears that Iraqis ripped babies from incubators during the invasion of Kuwait, threw them on the ground, and left them to die there.
Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
When the U.S. Senate voted for war on January 12, 1991, by a slim majority of 5 votes, 6 senators specifically referenced this incubator story. This incubator story would be the catalyst for them voting for the war. The problem was that this incubator story was completely fabricated.
With a UN mandate and U.S. leadership, President George Bush Sr. was determined to put an end to Saddam's goings-on.
Good evening. Saddam Hussein was given one last chance, set forth in very explicit terms to do what he should have done more than 6 months ago: withdraw from Kuwait without condition or further delay and comply fully with the resolutions passed by the United Nations Security Council. To the contrary, what we have seen is a redoubling of Saddam Hussein's efforts to destroy completely Kuwait and its people. I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
On the night of January 16 to 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm began, and with it, a new era of war reporting. The American Department of Defense controlled the depiction of the war more strictly than ever before.
As George Bush Sr. said it, in Vietnam we had to fight with one hand behind our back. Now we're not going to do that. So we're going to put in place a rigid media policy that makes sure that you, that is the media, can't impede us in the successful conduct of a war.
War suddenly looked like a computer game on the TV screen. There was talk of surgical and clean combat, as if the military could wage war with the help of the latest high-tech weapons without killing civilians.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being here. I promised...
The daily press conferences with General Norman Schwarzkopf, where he explained the progress of the war, would become legendary.
Da muss man wissen,
You have to know how the Americans do press relations, and you have to translate that. And if you don't do that properly, then you become the mouthpiece of the military. So I always thought it was crazy when the Americans did press conferences in wars.
Das amerikanische Militär lügt in Kriegen.
The American military was lying through their teeth in wars. For me, the exploitation of the media became clear in an interview given by the American commander-in-chief. He said that by involving the media, we wanted our opponents to do what we wanted them to do.
Was wir wünschen.
The way the media cooperates with the military and politicians would never be so intense in wars if it wasn't so normal outside of wars. My impression is that the two always need each other. Politics, military on one side, media on the other. But they don't necessarily need each other to be at eye level. They sometimes need each other in a hostile constellation where they are fighting each other, and sometimes need each other to go forward together.
Destroyed houses and landscapes were rarely seen in the official presentations. The suffering and death of the civilians usually remained invisible behind the media-friendly staging.
Along that this is not a war against the Iraqi people, and I think very shortly you're going to hear a little bit more about what we're doing to try and avoid hurting innocent people.
The reality looked different. A U.S. airstrike killed at least 300 civilians in a bunker on the outskirts of Baghdad. Reporter Peter Arnett's work for the news channel CNN established the so-called CNN effect, which has since been applied to the influence of live reporting on military decisions.
Why go after the civilians? But the U.S. were using civilian targets for psychological pressure on Saddam Hussein. My reporting of that forced them to restrict.
A short war. Saddam's mother of all battles lasted barely 100 hours.
98% of the enemy POWs either had in their possession or had seen our leaflets. And of those, some 70% did what the leaflets told them to do: abandon their equipment, follow the procedures for surrendering, go south towards Mecca to seek refuge across the border.
The sobering bottom line: 100,000 dead Iraqi soldiers, several thousand dead Iraqi civilians. Allied forces suffered some 300 casualties. In Kuwait, 700 wells were burning and around 500 million liters of oil flowed into the sea.
I think there's probably been no war that's been fought so humanely. And we saw instances, and the helicopter pilots just mentioned, that they would fire after a while. They would have these convoys of trucks. They would fire in front and on the sides to make them get out of the trucks and wait until they are out of the trucks, and then they would shoot up the trucks. I think you'll find very rare instances in history where that sort of humanity was employed on the battlefield.
Parodying Saddam, the victorious U.S. forces held a mother of all parades upon their return.
They went to the Gulf not because it was the expedient way, but because it was the American way. Through their sacrifice, as they caused brutal aggression to fall, they renewed our faith in ourselves.
Saddam Hussein was still in power. That was the price for the participation of other Arab states in the Second Gulf War. However, Saddam had to allow UN inspectors into the country to search for weapons of mass destruction. They received a cool reception. There were protests against inspectors. During their inspections, the scientists definitely came across suspicious facilities and traces of cover-ups. German biologist Gabriele Kratz-Watzak was one of them.
There were a lot of cat and mouse games involved. Because, for example, Iraq gave us forged or fake documents. Then they presented us with fake representatives who didn't know anything about the facility. And the real director, he was hidden from us. Or I had a document in my hand that pointed to weapons, and they snatched it out of my hand. So there were serious obstructions. Or they said you couldn't get into the facilities at all.
In Iraq, the inspectors' work was seen as pure U.S. propaganda.
Provocation is to create incidents which shouldn't have happened, in order to give the pretext for the Americans to use military power. To say that Iraq has denied access, Iraq is not cooperating, and this is how it is done.
The workers were also convinced that the truth was no longer important.
We only produce chlorine for civilian purposes, which means for drinking water. This has always been the case. The Americans only claimed the opposite so that they could attack us.
The man was not wrong. For months, well-known U.S. media had been reporting on allegedly hidden weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. Critical reports were sought in vain. A new war had not yet begun, but the soldiers were already there. In Kuwait, the 3rd U.S. Army was already rehearsing for the real thing. Officially, it was only an exercise, but the soldiers were as eager to fight as they were confident of victory. Baghdad's nightmare.
They'll feel it come.
I just know that I carry out the orders that I'm given by the president. So they tell me
Saddam Hussein is an evil man.
He says he's an evil man, and he's an evil man. That's orders. Personally, I think he is. So I wouldn't have any problems with it.
Demonizing the opponent, especially the leader on the opposite side, has always been typical. Napoleon as Antichrist. Of course, then also these Hitler comparisons to Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-un, the new Hitler. That has always been the way. Simply attribute everything evil to the opponent, to represent him as a devil in human form.
Saddam's undoing finally came with the attacks on September 11th. 2001. They changed the international situation decisively. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Americans experienced a major attack by an enemy on their own territory. Mastermind and soon-to-be public enemy number 1, terror leader Osama bin Laden. The attack on Afghanistan marked the start of the American campaign against the axis of evil. Kabul fell barely 2 months later. Thanks not in small part to massive air support, the Northern Alliance succeeded in driving the Taliban from power within a short time. A victory that reinforced the U.S.'s fatal belief that it could have a similarly easy time with other undesirable regimes. But bin Laden managed to escape. The U.S. quickly suspected that there must be a connection between bin Laden and Saddam Hussein. President Bush's State of the Union address came very close to a declaration of war.
This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
At the United Nations in New York, many delegates were skeptical when U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell presented the evidence to them in February 2003 that the U.S. government so urgently needed to justify an attack on Iraq.
The source was an eyewitness, an Iraqi chemical engineer who supervised one of these facilities. He actually was present during biological agent production runs.
Using the codename Curveball, the Iraqi was an informant for German intelligence. His reports on weapons labs suited the U.S. just perfectly.
Ladies and gentlemen, these are sophisticated facilities. For example, they can produce anthrax and botulinum toxin. In fact, they can produce enough dry biological agent in a single month to kill thousands upon thousands of people.
On February 15, 2003, millions of people around the world protested against U.S. plans to go to war. The previous mobilization of established U.S. media had not been able to arouse enthusiasm for war among the people.
In the run-up to the war, the debate about the media was very important because it happened in a time where there was no political nor any popular support.
Despite the protests, the U.S. government was sticking to its plans. According to the proponents of the war, it was no longer possible to resolve the Iraq conflict peacefully.
The mobilization of the public didn't actually take place until a few months before the American entry into the war. And politically as well, this mission wasn't covered by a mandate until shortly before the start of the war. That too has been controversial for a long time.
We must not allow the world's worst leaders to develop and harbor the world's worst weapons. I got a lot of tools at my disposal, and I'm a patient man. But I understand that history gives us an opportunity to make the world more peaceful.
When the entire Iraqi leadership was reportedly at a compound outside Baghdad, the timing seemed right for an attack.
The 2003 Iraq War began with the so-called decapitation strike. At the time, they said that we must start the war. The Americans and their allies must start the war now, because there was a unique opportunity to wipe out the Iraqi leadership in one blow. The message was clear. If we can, we would prevent a great war. We are only concerned about the leadership of the country. We'll try to hit it as completely as possible to keep the war short.
On March 20th, 2003, President George Bush Jr. continued his father's fight against Saddam Hussein, a fight that began 12 years earlier. He told the world that America had started the Third Gulf War for the sake of world peace.
On my orders, coalition forces have begun striking selected targets of military importance to undermine Saddam Hussein's ability to wage war.
In the war against Iraq, which was against international law, there were strict rules for journalists.
We had a war that was softened, so to speak, on the one hand. But on the other hand, journalists had no access at all. So there were these so-called press pools. There was a media center in Riyadh, and there was strict monitoring of access to the front line.
The so-called embedded journalists could only report what the army showed them.
There were absurd things. On the banks of the Tigris, I could see tanks from my hotel room during the war, and it never occurred to me that they would be Americans, because nowhere was it reported that the Americans were already on the banks of the Tigris.
U.S. military information confused correspondents as well as adversaries.
The Americans reported, "We have taken Baghdad airport." Then the Iraqi press people said, "Go there, take a look. There are no Americans there." They showed us the main terminal in the front, the main part of the airport. The Americans weren't there, but in fact, they were already there in the back.
Saddam's loyalists countered. With his exaggerated propaganda statements, Information Minister al-Sahaf even achieved a certain international notoriety.
They have no control even on themselves. Don't believe them. Those invaders will be slaughtered.
What had happened was similar to the Second Gulf War in 1991, where journalists were kept away from the front line, kept away in an attempt to conduct the war undisturbed. Now they were brought in to cover the Iraq War. The pictures and the war events coincided, and yet they had no idea what exactly was going on, because of course they couldn't simply go out and check on the ground in such a situation.
U.S. tanks rolled into the Iraqi capital. The embedded journalists got first-hand pictures and information, but details about casualties, military successes, or failures were not easily verifiable. How the war was perceived by the public was largely determined by the U.S. military. The world watched as young Marine Edward Chin ended the era of Saddam Hussein with 4 square meters of American cloth. The young soldier enjoyed his glory.
Feel satisfaction. I guess it's almost over. Probably get to go home soon.
What's it like being in the middle of Baghdad?
It's kind of crazy. Pretty good warm welcome from everybody, kind of.
Just a short time earlier, a controversy over the effectiveness of American war plans had shaken the U.S. public. A blitzkrieg, come, see, win, had failed because of unexpected resistance from Iraqi fighters. But Saddam's troops had not been able to withstand the highly armed Americans and British for long. After the symbolic fall of the tyrant, the American president addressed the Iraqi television audience for the first time.
This is George W. Bush, the President of the United States. At this moment, the regime of Saddam Hussein is being removed from power, and a long era of fear and cruelty is ending. American and coalition forces are now operating inside Baghdad, and we will not stop until Saddam's corrupt gang is gone.
On a street in the south of Iraq, young people had also removed a statue of Saddam from its pedestal. Now they were trying to set fire to the dictator's likeness in vain.
Saddam, he's underground. He's like mouse. Like mouse. He's without trust. He's liarman. But you did why? This years ago, nobody asked about us. Why?
Iraqi Shiites in the south had supported the Americans in the Second Gulf War and were later persecuted by Saddam. They apparently knew their tormentor well. In fact, Saddam Hussein was hiding in a hole in the ground when U.S. soldiers tracked him down. The dictator had been on the run for 8 months. He surrendered without resistance. The first pictures of his capture went around the world. 3 years later, the former ruler would stand trial before a special Iraqi tribunal. He was accused of a little-known massacre. Crimes against the Kurds and the Shiites were not being dealt with legally.
I'll have a word with you. The court has decided to sentence defendant Saddam Hussein al-Majid to be executed with hanging. Long live the people. Long live the nation. Down with the traitors. Down with the invaders. God is great. God is great. Go to hell with your law and your articles and clauses.
The death sentence was carried out just a few days after the trial ended. An outdoor location for real-time reporting on U.S. television. The reporters could barely leave the hotel after the war began. Information about how the war was going was scarce.
Believe anything the military tells you. Their objective is to win the war. And that's all they care about.
And also public opinion.
Public opinion is part of winning the war. Telling the truth is only another tool to winning the war. If they don't need to tell the truth to win the war, they don't do it.
The military doesn't want journalists to enlighten the public. They have to do their job. And the journalists are acceptable when the mission is supported and strengthened, when the home front says, yes, we are at war, which is then also gladly shown. But the idea that something like this happens naively and spontaneously is, I think, outdated. That's how it used to be.
An Iraqi surface-to-surface missile was intercepted by a Patriot missile over Kuwait. This was not
In addition to military regulations, changes in the media landscape also had a major influence on war reporting.
In 1991, Saddam Hussein's war, or the war against Saddam Hussein, when he occupied Kuwait, there was only one report a day. And 12 years later, there was the summation, so morning magazines, noon magazines. and a morning report 3 times, because the people who watched television at breakfast at 6 were different from those who watched it at 7 and 8. And then when you are in the spotlight, you get switched 3 times. And then that continues at 11. And you add a 2-hour time difference. Then you're kind of busy all day with the news, and you can't shoot, and you can't do anything, and you basically don't really get what's going on around you. And this is how you get so-called fast food journalism.
Baghdad, a few days after the end of the war. Hardly anything indicated that fighting was still taking place. The fate of the city was now being decided by the new occupiers, and they had resolved to be received as liberators. Tried and tested image cultivation after just about every American firefight. Chewing gum for the kids. Exiled Iraqis could now return to their homeland. The first to arrive wore U.S. Army uniforms. Their reception was mostly friendly for a while.
Everybody kissed me and he say, "You guys, you do great job and thank you very much." And nobody likes Saddam, believe me. Saddam is a big killer. Saddam is each family in Iraq, maybe each family crying in Iraq because Saddam Hussein. So everybody happy to finish all the Saddam regime.
The joy didn't last long, given the rapidly deteriorating living conditions.
The situation's improving. Nothing's improving at all. It's the same as before. The American invasion is good. What's good about it? Our suffering has become much greater. At least under Saddam, there was water. It's really got worse. We have no more drinking water.
It was not only the destroyed infrastructure that caused problems. The U.S. government had not provided enough soldiers to control the large cities. Looting was the order of the day. There were no structures to punish crimes. A lawless space was being created that would not allow Iraq to calm down and would become a breeding ground for extremists. But U.S. soldiers on the ground were still optimistic.
Better than it was a few days ago. It's getting a lot better. It's doing pretty good.
Do you expect this situation in Baghdad, the kind of looting and shootings and everything?
We expected some of it, but I mean, you'll always have that after a situation like this. But it's getting a lot better. It's getting a lot better.
The military leadership in Washington, on the other hand, refused to face reality. Looting, for Rumsfeld, it was nothing but propaganda by malicious media people.
The images you are seeing on television, you are seeing over and over and over, and it's the same picture of some person walking out of some building with a vase. And you see it 20 times. And you think, my goodness, were there that many vases?
An irony of history, the supposed justification for the war that Iraq was supporting the al-Qaeda terrorist network only became a reality when U.S. troops attacked. The extremists would continue to cause unrest in Iraq for years to come. The influence of the long-repressed Shiites grew particularly rapidly. In their strongholds, monuments to the dictator were painted over with likenesses of Iranian ayatollahs.
The Americans can rule our bodies with their weapons, but they will never control our souls, our will, and our faith. The U.S. forces have taken Iraq by their military superiority, but in the long run, they will not be able to rule the people against their will. The people will face their new challenge, and if the Iraqi people are united and want the Americans to leave, then the occupiers will have to leave.
The violence escalated. Countless assassinations shook the country. Fewer and fewer journalists reported directly on the ground about the fragile post-war peace. In the spring of 2004, only 50 Western reporters remained out of more than 200. Briton Lee Gordon was one of them.
I came here in January, beginning of January last year, so just 13 or 14 months. And my original brief was to come here and drop into Iraq for about 3 days and leave before the outbreak of war. And I didn't, and the rest is history.
Many reporters saw their work as an obligation. Otherwise, many pictures wouldn't exist. Perhaps not even these. The horror of war left its mark on the mind.
I'm not sure that one does sort of clear these things. I suppose when one gets to the stage where one can push the images completely from one's mind, then it's probably time to sort of step back and get out of it, because I think the important thing is to retain those images, because they shape your thoughts and feed into one's reporting, on other stories. So, no, I don't think I, kind of clear my mind like a blank tape afterwards.
Reporters as eyewitnesses to the horror of war, a function no medium can fulfill.
This group, they're invaluable, in my opinion, in their importance, because they cannot be replaced by anyone else. They have the job of showing us that this is real, how real wars can be. And when we experience this through the frontline reporters in mostly very manipulated forms, because they themselves only get to see manipulated realities, it's more authentic than what we have here.
An emergency hospital run by the German aid group Kap Anamur in Baghdad. 3/4 of the patients were children. There was a lack of electricity, clean water, and medicine. German surgeon Hans-Joachim Witzel assessed the situation in Iraq at the time more accurately than most U.S. military officials.
I do believe that people will come to their senses and that the country will improve. It will certainly take 5 to 7 years. They first have to sort out their own skirmishes among themselves, and there will be some more power struggles, which you can already see a bit of here in Baghdad. There seem to be mafia structures developing, and what you hear at night in terms of noise of battle is probably mostly fighting between these rival groups among themselves.
Many of the children brought there, suffering from diarrhea due to contaminated drinking water, were dehydrated and malnourished. The humanitarian situation was worse than it was during Saddam's time, complained the residents of Baghdad.
The atmosphere is changing. The Americans are no longer, at least in the areas where we work and where people talk to us about it, there the Americans are no longer seen as liberators, but as occupiers. And in the public, somewhat simplistically structured imagination, the Americans are being blamed for all the misery at the moment. Are people here aware of that? You can't ask me whether the Americans are aware of what's coming. I'm just a simple pediatrician. I'm afraid that they didn't anticipate that. So here, when the Arabs talk among themselves, the word Vietnam often comes up. Even I as a German understand that.
No other war had left such a lasting mark on the American nation as Vietnam. Even now, decades later, Vietnam was still labeled traumatic. War reporter Philip Jones Griffiths worked there for the Magnum Agency. Now he was reminded of Saigon once again.
Using the same phrases, the same method of trying to convince people of essentially what cannot be, what is not the truth. And you could interchange the word Iraq or Baghdad with Vietnam, and the phraseology is exactly the same. We're bringing democracy to these people, and we're going to give it to them whether they like it or not. I mean, that's exactly what happened in Vietnam.
The creeping feeling that they had once again entered into a conflict with an unforeseeable outcome was becoming increasingly real among Americans.
40% in the Newsweek poll said it's like Vietnam, which is another way of saying it's not going very well. Many of the people in America don't remember Vietnam. They weren't alive, or they weren't old enough to have made judgments about it. So the metaphor of Vietnam isn't so much about the specifics, it's about this is an American intervention that's not going well.
An impression that was probably created by images such as these. Iraqi insurgents shooting at U.S. vehicles. In 2 weeks alone, 99 U.S. soldiers were reported to have died in Fallujah, a city west of Baghdad. Exact figures were not available, certainly not of Iraqi civilian casualties. Estimates were as high as 2,500. Excerpt from a video in which hooded rebels proudly present an American hostage.
My name is Keith Matthew Maupin. I am a soldier in the 1st Division. I am married and have a 10-month-old child. I came to liberate Iraq, but I didn't come willingly. I wanted to stay with my child.
Psychological warfare using prisoners of war has a long tradition. Viet Cong fighters also like to use frightened U.S. soldiers gladly and successfully for propaganda purposes.
Dwayne P. Bobrick, 1st Lieutenant. I miss my family very much. I wish I could be with them now.
Pulitzer Prize winner and Vietnam expert Stanley Karnow believes the Bush-Iraq connection will be as traumatic as the Johnson-Vietnam connection once was.
In Vietnam, American soldiers would go into villages, they'd burn down a whole village, assuming that everybody was the enemy. And of course, lots of innocent people were killed. Here you're getting the same thing. They hear a shot ringing out from some building, and the next thing you know, the tanks come in and destroy the building, and everybody in it is killed.
In record time, a superior American army conquered the country and overthrew the ruler, and was then busy working around the clock trying to lose a war they won so quickly. Memories of the great national trauma of the U.S. lingered for many, but only one person spoke out. Senator Edward Kennedy accused Bush of isolating the country in foreign policy.
He's the problem, not the solution. Iraq is George Bush's Vietnam, and this country needs a new president.
In the meantime, more and more soldiers were giving serious thought to the purpose of their deployment. Their frustrations with the difficult situation in the Arab country were clearly palpable.
I think the motive for why we're here kind of got distorted. As soon as the terrorists came in and did the strikes on the Twin Towers, they used that as a motive of Iraq's harboring terrorists, and then it was the weapons of mass destruction. And then there was never weapons of mass destruction found. So then that just makes you reach the question, what was the
That was a question that the American public would soon be asking itself, but it took a change of presidents to turn things around. What remained was a deep-seated distrust of politics and the media.
One has the feeling that lying in politics may not necessarily increase, but the perception is that more and more political actors lie and get away with it, that there are no consequences.
In 2011, U.S. troops finally pulled out of Iraq after a war that was neither clean nor victorious. But the fiction of a predictable course of the war thanks to modern technology remained.
Weapons are becoming more and more precise, more and more accurate, as are drones. The automation of war is horrifying. Weapon systems and computers in weapon systems decide who gets killed and who doesn't. You can't win a war with weapons. War is always won by people.
The new way of waging war and the changing media landscape will make objective reporting in the future very difficult.
Basically, what we see is reduced to what we are supposed to see and what goes into the media already prefabricated and can no longer be controlled journalistically at all. And we're not going to find a one-size-fits-all solution to that. There is no such thing. Because when there are wars, then every society needs this kind of secrecy, of control. There is no other way. The best thing is not to wage war.
Das Beste ist, keine Kriege zu führen.